You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another TV show review. Today we're finally getting around to reviewing The Sopranos, a show which I started watching back in March and finished just last weekend. Now, I also watched the movie The Many Saints of Newark, which was the prequel to The Sopranos. I will be bringing that up in this review as well. But The Sopranos is a live-action TV drama by HBO about a modern mafia family, and sort of the death of the mob, as it were. Because it's showing sort of how the mafia is kind of on its last legs in today's day and age. And Tony himself, earlier in the series, even says he feels like he came in right at the end. Now, The Sopranos is widely considered to be one of the greatest shows of all time, and it paved the way for future shows such as Breaking Bad, Succession, and many others that would take the anti-hero live-action TV drama to a different level. Sopranos paved the way for a lot of that, and in many ways hasn't been topped. Now, that said, I personally still think Breaking Bad is the best show of all time, objectively speaking. Sopranos is easily my second favorite live-action TV drama. It went on for a total of 6 seasons, although the 6th season was split in half, so kind of 7. There's a total of 86 episodes. One of the wraparound premises of the show is Tony talking to the therapist, Dr. Jennifer Melfi, and telling her about his problems. I thought that this was going to be a prominent thing throughout the entire series, and that Melfi hearing Tony's life story would be sort of the wraparound segments the whole time. Not really so. Melfi actually becomes less and less prominent as the series goes on, and we'll get into that a little bit later. That's one of the criticisms I kind of have with the show, but we'll get into it a little bit more later. There are a lot of people who think that the show is better early on, and then think that the later seasons aren't as good. I actually would have to disagree. I think the show gets progressively better with each season, despite my criticisms of some of the strange choices I feel like they made later on. I'm a big fan of mafia fiction, so obviously I naturally liked The Sopranos. It was really fun. A lot of good drama, really great characters. I think that the characters are what really carries this show. The characters are so well written and so enjoyable and likable, and also pretty cruel. Tony Soprano, for instance, is easily the most hypocritical character in all of fiction that I've seen. The whole point of the show is, right, he's trying to grow and trying to be better with all this therapy and stuff, but realistically, as the show goes on, he becomes worse and worse as a person. Season 1 Tony is a much better person than Season 6B Tony. Tony just becomes more and more of a piece of shit as it goes on, and begins to justify himself more and more and just kind of accept it, which is a really entertaining watch, but it's funny, because, people will always be like, well, if you idolize Tony Soprano, you do it wrong. I'm like, who could idolize Tony Soprano? He's a fucking hypocrite, and also kind of pathetic in some regards. He's really unhinged, really insecure, constantly insults people, but if someone insults him, he'd just as soon kill them just for insulting him. It's got a very unique family dynamic in the show, where a lot of the family is constantly at each other's throats. There's times where they try to get each other whacked. Tony kills quite a lot of his friends throughout the series for very small things. There's lots of people who get killed pretty consistently in this show. Early on in the show, in Season 1, the first major guy that Tony whacks is this guy named... Spoiler, here comes the spoilers. Is this guy named Pussy, which is a really funny nickname that he had. But anyway, Pussy gets arrested and becomes a rat, and so then Tony has to take him out. But it takes him forever to come to the decision to actually do it. Whereas later on in the show, he kills people pretty quickly, so he just becomes more and more ruthless with each season. Now, my personal favorite character is Tony's nephew, who's actually his cousin, but he calls him his nephew, Christopher Moltisanti. Easily my favorite character. He's sort of Tony's protege, sort of trying to make his own and make a name for himself. He's very hot-headed and constantly does things recklessly, especially early on. He gets addicted to drugs, but he does later get clean. He eventually gets a new wife and has a baby after he has to have Adriana, who is also a really good character, who's his fiance. She becomes a rat, and he gets her whacked. Like I said, there's a lot of death and betrayal and stuff like that in this series. It's a pretty recurring theme. Christopher is especially good when he's in a duo with Paulie, and I think that they should have done more with that, because Paulie and Christopher is a great duo. Like, Pine Barrens is easily my favorite episode, where Christopher and Paulie are in the woods trying to chase down this Russian guy who they thought that they killed, but then he gets up and runs off. And it's actually never revealed as to whether or not that guy survived, or if he was dead somewhere in the woods. Other great characters are those such as Junior Soprano, who's Tony's uncle, who is going senile as the show goes on. I think early series Junior is one of my favorite characters. As he becomes more and more senile, he becomes less and less relevant as a character. Characters becoming less relevant is also kind of a running theme throughout the show, which, like I said, I have my criticisms of. You can think of an artistic reason for why it happens, given the nature of how the show goes on, but again, we'll get into that a little bit more later. The show has some pretty iconic antagonists as well. We got Richie Aprile, Ralph Cifaretto, and of course Phil Leotardo, Mr. 20 Years in the Can himself. The show has a lot of funny dialogue in addition to its iconic, good, dramatic dialogue, because the characters are constantly getting words wrong or incorrectly saying phrases and things like that, which is really funny. Another great character is Paulie, who was actually played by a real ex-Mafia guy, Tony Sirico, who actually did time in prison for being in the Mafia. Paulie is one of the best characters. I wish that there was more with him as it went on, but I do feel like, again, like many characters in the later seasons, he was pushed aside a little bit. He still has plenty of screen time, don't get me wrong, but I would have loved to have seen more Paulie and Christopher duo stuff. They do have a little bit here and there, and I do think that they always have a consistently good chemistry when they're on screen, but nevertheless, I do wish that there was more done with it. The show also does a lot of interesting things with dream sequences, and has a lot of stuff that's clearly inspired by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and things like that. Melfi's form of psychology is very unique compared to the kind you see now. It's very Freudian and about getting to the root cause of shit, which, personally, as someone who's not a big fan of the psychology field, especially in today's day and age, I actually find that very refreshing, because I think that trying to get to the root cause of things makes more sense than just validating everything. That's a whole other tangent that I'm not going to go off on. So yeah, the show's got good drama, it's got good violence, and it's got its share of laughs. A character that gets a lot of hate that I don't understand is AJ. I think AJ, especially in Season 6, is actually a really good character. A lot of people don't like him because he's kind of pathetic and whiny, but that's to be expected. The life he grew up in and how young he is. Honestly, AJ in Season 6, I think has the most interesting character arc that the character has. And I think he's a much more interesting son character than Walter Jr. ever was. Again, Breaking Bad I do think is the better show, but there are aspects of this show that I think it does do better. And I think that the characters overall are in some ways more iconic in Sopranos. Again, I prefer Breaking Bad, plus I think it is objectively better. But I do think if we're talking strictly on a character level, if we're talking number of characters, Sopranos has more iconic characters. As far as numbers, it has a larger number of them. Breaking Bad, I think, has characters that stand out as more iconic on an individual level, like Walter White, I think, is the most iconic character. But a lot of the characters in The Sopranos, could go toe-to-toe with them as far as being iconic. Alright, now let's get to some of my criticisms of the show. So, The Sopranos does have some issues in pacing at times. There are time skips. I believe that it's kind of hard to keep up with at times. This isn't a major issue, it's more of a nitpick, and it's easy to get past. But there are times where I feel like there's time skips that I don't know exactly how much time has passed. But again, that's not super important. It's not the biggest deal in the world. But something that is somewhat of a criticism for me is that, as I said throughout this review, there are people who get pushed aside as it goes on. There's characters that become less and less relevant. Now, you could see from an artistic standpoint, since Tony is our point of view character, Tony becomes more and more self-centered as the series goes on. Perhaps that's an intentional artistic choice, because Tony's thinking less of these people, so they're less prominent in the show. I especially am disappointed with the portrayal of Dr. Melfi, in that she becomes less and less prominent. I thought the stuff with her in the early seasons was great, and the fact that she just gets kind of pushed aside really disappointed me. I certainly didn't like the way her story arc ended, with basically being peer pressured into kicking Tony out, and then buying into it and thinking that it was hopeless to try and help him. I really hated that, because I thought that they had a really good back and forth, and I thought that as a psychologist and patient, they were a good duo as well. I will say that Melfi did put up with a lot of shit from Tony, and still stayed with him till a long time. Like, there's plenty of times where she should have cut ties with him early on with how aggressive he was earlier on. But when she actually eventually does throw him out, it feels like bullshit. It's like, well, fuck you then, Melfi. You bought into all that shit, and now you're throwing him out and giving up on him. Now, you could make the argument that maybe the stuff those people were saying was true, and that it was just making Tony a more effective criminal. But again, I'm not the biggest fan of the psychology field. I think it's a lot of bullshit. So I kind of wish Melfi had stood her ground and said, no, fuck you, I'm not giving up. But I also understand why they did it. It's the episode before last. They're winding it down. They're giving characters send-offs, that kind of thing. Now let's talk about the ending, because the ending is one thing that has been controversial in pop culture for quite some time. The infamous cut to black. Now, I think it's pretty obvious what this ending means, and a lot of Sopranos fans agree, but there are still some that think it's much more open to interpretation and have other theories. But I think it's most logical that, at the very least, Tony was killed in that moment. Because they give a lot of foreshadowing with it. You know, earlier on in the series, you have AJ mentioning black meaning death. Bobby telling Tony, I bet you don't even hear it when it happens. Things like that. So, like, we see Tony's death from his perspective, where it just immediately goes black because he doesn't even know what happens. He was just killed. Now, there is some symbolism with the number 3 and a few other things that lead you to believe that the entire family that was at the table, so Tony, AJ, and Carmela, were all killed while Meadow survived. I definitely think there's some truth to that, especially since it goes out of its way to show you that Meadow was delayed quite a bit getting in. So that's kind of maybe hinting that it's important that she was late to this dinner because, again, she was the only one to survive. Obviously, I didn't completely come to this conclusion on my own. I did watch a video analyzing the ending, so do bear that in mind. I think that there is definitely some truth to it, and there's a lot of Last Supper symbolism as well. The show does some really interesting stuff with paranormal and religious themes, especially with Paulie, but I also feel like people overstate that when they talk about it, because there's really only a few scenes of it, and I was honestly kind of disappointed that it wasn't such a much bigger thing, because I see all these video essays that I haven't watched, mind you, that talk about how it's like a big thing with Paulie's character. But again, there's maybe 5 scenes in the entire series of it, if that. So I just feel like they under-delivered on it as well. There's a lot of little things in Sopranos, plot lines that don't really go anywhere, and things like that. But something that I will say about that is that it is also realistic. Something about The Sopranos and certain things I feel are intentionally anticlimactic, because that's how life is. The Sopranos, I think, in a lot of ways is more realistic than Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is a better written story, but The Sopranos is much more about how life actually is. Things being disappointing, going out with a whimper, that kind of thing, right? It's not everything being grandiose, and not everything has this big, massive conclusion. In real life, things aren't like that, and I think Sopranos does do a good job at illustrating the way real life is, where things don't always end the way you want it to. There's not always some big, grand ending. But The Sopranos ending, I think, is actually good in the artistic way in which it's carried out. And I think that the fact that people are still talking about it to this day proves that it is an iconic ending, whether people like it or not. The fun comes with theorizing in it, right? Who shot Tony? Did the family get killed? What happened after that? All these things. There's a lot of speculation that does make it fun, and that is something that is fun with art. There are some people who theorize that maybe Tony's waking up from a dream here at the ending, and that's why it cuts to black. I think that's far less likely than him getting shot. Although there is obviously precedent for that, too. I mean, they do a lot of stuff with dream sequences, plus there was the entire mini-arc where Tony was in a coma after getting shot by Junior, which, by the way, I thought was fucking great. Apparently that's divisive amongst the fan base. There are a lot of people who don't like the coma episodes. I thought the coma episodes were fantastic. Another thing that's apparently divisive is a lot of people don't like the character that Steve Buscemi plays, Tony Blundetto. But again, I also thought he was a great character. Frankly, I don't think there were any characters that I disliked as a character in The Sopranos. Like, there's some that I obviously disliked as a person. You know, like Ralphie, total piece of shit. Literally killed a woman who was pregnant with his child. And there's others that I obviously thought were shitty people. In fact, most of the characters are bad people in the traditional sense because they all are murderers. Even Bobby, who people have a soft spot for, is still a hardened criminal and does still kill that guy and says that it should have happened sooner. A lot of people like to think that he was like super innocent, but no, he was still a mafia guy. And that said, That's the thing with this show, right, is it has all these hardened criminals, these murderers and bad people that they make you sympathize with and view as people. It humanizes them. But now that we're this far into the review, I suppose I should talk about The Many Saints of Newark. Now, this movie is incredibly divisive. A lot of the fan base absolutely hates it, although it actually has pretty decent reviews on Amazon. Now, The Many Saints of Newark is a prequel that follows Christopher's dad, Dickie Moltisanti, and shows him taking out his own father, and getting with his stepmom, who would actually become Christopher's mother, because Dickie's wife was infertile. It has young versions of many of the characters. It takes place in both the 60s and the 70s. So we see a kid Tony and a teenage Tony, a kid Janice and a teenage Janice. We see younger versions of Paulie, Silvio, and a few others. I refuse to accept as canon that Silvio's hair is a wig. I don't like that. That pissed me off, actually. But honestly, I think that this movie was a lot better than people give it credit for. I thought that the entire plot with Dickie was great. I thought that his entire plot played out, and I think that his casting was good. There was a lot of weird casting choices for some of the characters. Like, I don't really understand why they cast the guy they did for Paulie. I thought that Vera Farmiga was a weird choice for Livia. But there was a bunch of them that were kind of odd like that. But nevertheless, a lot of the subplots were good as well. I think they spent a little bit too much time on Harold, the black guy. I think they spent a little bit too much time on his plot. I actually think they should have done more with having a war between the black characters and the Italian characters. Should have done more with, like, gang warfare on that. They do a little bit that's actually really good, but I think they focus too much on the build-up to it and not enough on just having them, like, go to war with each other. That would have been way cooler in my book. But I actually think it's overall a movie that gets better as it goes on. And I think that overall it is a really good prequel. Again, there's certain things that I think are stupid. They got certain details from the show wrong. For instance, Christopher says that Tony choked him to death when he suffocated him. I mean, you know, there's some overlap with those two things, but I think it's strange that they would make that mistake. And a few other things. But nevertheless, I thought it was overall a decent movie. Certainly nowhere near as good as the show, and it's certainly no El Camino when it comes to follow-up movies to these live-action dramas. But I don't think it deserves the hate it gets. Like I said, there's certain things I refuse to accept about it, like I refuse to accept Silvio's hair as a wig. I do like that Silvio was still just as loyal to Tony back then as he was in the show. A lot of people also think that Silvio's age is inaccurate, but if you actually listen to dialogue in the show, it's actually kind of inconsistent in the show itself, just how old Silvio is. So I think that, again, I saw a video on this, so it's not like I'm coming to this conclusion on my own. There is a lot of evidence to show that Silvio is a lot older than Tony, so I think that people who get obsessed over the age, that he's too old, I think that that the age of Silvio is perfectly fine and consistent with the show, given that, again, there's 2 scenes where Silvio is implied to be Tony's age, compared to many more scenes where he's heavily implied to be older than Tony. Overall, it was a good movie. Not as good as the show, but it was a good movie. Again, there were things I didn't like about it, but overall, pretty solid. So yeah, that's The Sopranos and The Many Saints of Newark. I know I didn't touch on The Many Saints of Newark a ton, but, you know, that's basically a double-length episode, right? Because it was a 2-hour movie, whereas all the episodes of the show were each an hour. Overall, I think that the show was a great watch. I think that everyone should check out the show. And if you're really interested, check out the movie too, but the show is obviously the main one that I care about. Movie isn't as good as the show, but it is still worth a watch if you are a fan. And I definitely don't think it deserves the hate it gets. The show is great. I think it did pave the way for a lot of live-action TV dramas. But I do still think Breaking Bad is better. But The Sopranos pretty quickly became my second favorite live-action TV drama within just a couple episodes. It's also got an iconic intro and a lot of iconic characters. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about The Sopranos. Hopefully this review was in-depth enough for you guys. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.
Subscribe to Fugitive Red-Eye.